Hello everyone, my name is The Fox. In this video we're going to be reviewing Anbernic's latest handheld, their RG40XX. Once again, we're seeing the H700 chipset that is in all of the XTX or XX platforms that are on Anbernic handhelds as of late. This one features a more candy bar styled form factor with a really nice 4-inch 640 by 480 4x3 display. You know what, let's just get straight into the disassembly and specs of this device right now. Talking about the tech specs, I thought it would be a neat idea if we just disassemble the device and we can show what's going on with the device. I'm also going to talk about what's going on the backside of this handheld as well. Let's go ahead and quickly take a look at the battery. So we have effectively what is a 12 watt-hour battery, where you can see right there, and we will be showing off battery life in just a moment, pretty much right after this particular segment that we're going to be looking at. And then we're going to take a look at the business end of the chip, which you can see is that all-winner H700 right here. This right here is where we're going to be doing most of the heavy lifting for the emulation with those quad-core ARM CPUs. However, the GPU that is located on here as well, we only have 1 gig of RAM, so having a 64-bit operating system really isn't necessary with only having 1 gig of RAM. If we were to go over 4 gigs, then it would actually matter. Then on the bottom here, this is where we're going to have our Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. This is the chipset for it. What's interesting is you can see these leads right here. They're like spring clips. Typically, you would have sockets for pigtail leads that would go off into pigtails. And instead, what they've opted for was this socket design where the spring clips will make contact with this middle metal piece right here. And then we have just a really tiny antenna, which will broadcast and receive on the bottom portion of this plastic. And plastic isn't going to interfere with that signal. And especially where you hold the device, your hand really isn't going to be getting in the way of that as well. So it's an interesting design choice that they did, getting away from those pigtail leads. I guess they've had problems with people, I don't know, either ripping them off and not being able to get them on or breaking them. So rather than perhaps they went to this spring design because it will offer them less customer service problems. A little bit interesting overall. Here we can see the little rumble motor, and it's just kind of connected right here. The PCB of this one is from April 30th, so the beginning of May. So this board's like almost 2 months old, and shows you just how far along Anbernic had this device before I even got a handle of it. So this is what the inside of the device looks like, and for the most part, everything that is on the device. On the back, we also have this kind of shielding that is here, and I'm not sure why they have it here. Perhaps it's for thermal reasons, but when we take a look at our thermal imaging, again, that'll show up after here, most of the heat that we have will be built up right along this area, right where the CPU is. And then quickly going over the front, we have our Anbernic D-pad, our dual analog sticks, face buttons, select and start, a menu button. Around the top, we have our stacked shoulder buttons. Thankfully, Anbernic has stopped doing their inline shoulder buttons. We have a mini HDMI port, a reset button. If anything gets stuck, you can just push this and it'll force restart the system. A USB-C port, which we're going to be able to charge from this at around 7.5 watts max, and it also acts as a USB on-the-go port, volume up and down, and our power button. And then following along on the bottom, we finish off with the downward firing stereo speakers, our dual micro SD card slots, and our 3.5mm audio jack. And that pretty much completes our look at the disassembly and the tech specs for this device. With that out of the way, let's talk about battery life on the RG40XX-H. So there's going to be 2 different ways that we can do this. Typically, what I like to do is a best case and worst case scenario. Worst case, I try to push the machine as hard as I can. So I did N64 emulation, and I used fast forward, and I had the screen at brightest, and I had the LED rings around the analog stick. With that, we got around 3 hours and 20 minutes of battery life. When we disable the LEDs around the analog sticks and use medium brightness and have something more like PlayStation 1 emulation, we're looking at around 7 hours and 25 minutes of battery life. Generally speaking, you're going to be looking at a best case scenario of 7 hours and 30 minutes and a worst case scenario of around 3 hours and 30 minutes, depending on the type of game and how demanding you are pushing this device. Typically, I would say that you're going to get closer to 4 hours, 4.5 hours as a worst case scenario, because the situation that I'm doing is kind of unrealistic. But in an absolute worst case, if you were going to be playing some ports and stuff that actually were to utilize a lot of stuff on this particular device, but I think that is a little bit of a exaggerated worst case scenario. With that exaggerated worst case scenario, pushing the device as hard as we can, what type of thermals can we expect out of this device? And largely when we take a look at it, like we had talked about in the specs part of the opener for this video, most of the heat is generated on the right side of the device where the H700 chipset lives. It's not coming from the battery at all, and that padding that Anbernic has across the entire back pad does help a bit. However, we do see that On the right side, along the face of the device, heat is transferring to the outside plastic, and it also transfers to the outside plastic on the reverse side as well. However, it really should be noted that what we're looking at here is not very hot at all. We're showing differences from the thermal camera, and it can look exaggerated, but the reality is that it's not hot at all, and it's barely warm at all. It does get a tinge warm on the right-hand side, so thermals-wise, I think it's just fine for a very low-powered device. Continuing along my review, I do want to talk about what I often like talking about Anbernic devices, and that's the D-pad. Typically for Anbernic devices, they do a really good job with their D-pad design. This is a membrane-based D-pad, and I actually really enjoy what they did with their dome-based design on the RG40XX SP design that they have here. However, for some people, they don't like how loud it is, and they will try to mute it by putting like tape over that. Because this is not a dome-based design and it is membrane-based, what we're looking at is something that is actually the best membrane-based D-pad in the traditional D-pad design that Anbernic has ever done. I have really liked their Saturn-like D-pad that they made. That one was also excellent, but when we take a look at almost like a traditional Super Nintendo D-pad, this is, without a doubt, the best D-pad that Anbernic has made to date. Typically, I've always reserved them for being like B+ or A-, and this is the first time that I think for this standard type of membrane-based D-pad that Anbernic has knocked it out of the park, and this is an A+ D-pad design. Complementing the D-pad are the very nice face buttons. Now, typically, I'm not very harsh on face buttons. As long as they're not mushy, I'm okay. And Anbernic does a really good job with the membrane and how far they snap and are crunchy. Rolling your thumb across them feels really nice. There's no fatigue or anything in trying to press them down with any type of force, like having a mushy face button. So really good face buttons, and this is something that always is just fine for me. One thing that I do love is they are using stacked shoulder buttons, so they're no longer inline. This is something that Anbernic did a lot in previous designs, especially last year, so I'm glad that they have left that behind and are just going forward with a stacked shoulder design. So that's a big plus. Overall, the traditional game controller design that is on this device is excellent, which is unfortunate because the analog sticks on these are exceedingly sensitive. The amount of travel that they have, even just pushing in a little, goes from like a little bit of feedback to maximum feedback. So they are just outrageously sensitive in every way. And unfortunately, they just have a very D-pad-like quality to them, which is not an analog-like quality. So if you were to play, say, like Quake, where you wanted to use the dual analog sticks and use the right stick to move around, you have to really dial the sensitivity on the mouse look way down just to like be able to look around correctly. Otherwise, you'll just whip around and you really can't finesse it all that much at all. As you can see in the video here, just pushing it a little bit and then pushing it a lot, there's not a ton of variance. So it's super sensitive insofar as it's just a D-pad-like design. That's not to say the analog sticks don't have a purpose. Obviously, with Nintendo DS emulation, you can emulate a stylus with the analog stick, so you can move around with the left analog stick, and then you can click in the R3 button or the right analog stick to act as a tap for the stylus or pressing down on the stylus. So you can emulate a stylus, which you would need for DS emulation. So if you were to play something like Nintendogs, you can pet the dog's head, and it offers that availability with those dual analog sticks, which is not possible on something like the RG40XX SP, which only has a D-pad. So if you wanted something with the H700 that is in a better, smaller form factor, but still has analog sticks, this is a design that might be for you. One thing I do want to say real quick is even though Anbernic has done a very good job setting up the firmware for this as a default firmware, a lot of things are pre-baked and really, really nice. They still, to this day, have the wrong configuration for Virtual Boy. You're going to have to jump into Virtual Boy. They have the right analog stick mapped to the wrong right D-pad inputs. You actually have to change them. They have like right D-pad plus minus. You actually have to make it right D-pad up, right D-pad right. And if you don't do this, it's nearly impossible to play Telero Boxer, because Telero Boxer, you needed to use both D-pads on the Virtual Boy to actually play it. And with the corrected control scheme, you should really try to play Telero Boxer because it is a fantastic Virtual Boy game that is locked to that platform. If you haven't played it, you owe it to yourself to play it. There's only about 5 opponents that you can play through, and it gets exceedingly difficult in terms of how much memorization you need in terms of a punch-out game. But it is still an excellent game, and with those quick fixes, you can play Virtual Boy just fine with those analog sticks. So while I do appreciate having dual analog sticks for Nintendo DS emulating a stylus, for ports that can use dual analog sticks so you can play like FPS and stuff, and for Virtual Boy, which needs 2 D-pads if you just configure it correctly, there's lots of areas where having dual analog sticks is super helpful, and I'm glad that it's there because having more inputs means you can play more games that require just a variety of different inputs. I just wish that they were better and more analog. So that really is the only thing that I would say is a negative about the control design for the RG40XX Overall, Anbernic's firmware that they ship with this device is really well done. There's lots of little nice touches here and there. When you play Game Boy games, it's going to have a nice overlay that'll kind of have nice scaling for the type of display that's there, and it'll automatically put in a shader that'll make it a green type of tint on it, so it kind of replicates how you would anticipate a Game Boy game to be. You can go ahead in RetroArch settings, just press the menu button and go into shaders, and then turn that off if you don't want that. But I kind of like what they have done, and they've, in my opinion, have made a lot of nice little choices, especially for Game Boy Advance. Now, while the display isn't perfect for Game Boy Advance, they do have a bit of a border, which I don't really care about. However, they do have a bit of a shader, which has a mask on there to kind of replicate how the LCD felt on the SP, the Game Boy Advance SPs. And they kind of pepper this in throughout the firmware. Not every system is going to have a shader or an overlay. When talking about what is the top-end emulation that we're going to be seeing on the RG40XX, typically you're going to be looking at N64, which is using Parallel, which is a very nice, accurate renderer for N64 emulation. You have Dreamcast, which has been possible for quite a while. However, it has progressed quite a bit, and there are far less glitches that we've seen previously, so that has smoothed out over the time. PSP emulation also is possible on this device. However, given the screen that is on the RG40XX is a 4:3 screen, and PSP had a wider screen, so you're going to be scaling this in a weird way that I don't think a lot of games translate very well. It's up to you. Obviously, this is to taste, so if you're fine with scrunching a PSP game down, that's up to you, and if that's something you like, then go ahead. Most PSP games are going to be quite playable on this device. There is still a ton of variety. Obviously, there are still a ton of systems below N64, Dreamcast, and PSP that'll run just fine on this device, but we also have things like Pico 8, which is possible to run on this, and there's a lot of good Pico 8 games that are out there. I would suggest you look into Pico 8 games. There's a lot that are completely free that you can just toss on this device and start playing. Really cool games and really good small concept-like games that are just fun to play. A few of the other things that we have to talk about is Anbernic was trying to bolster what was available in the firmware and included some PortMaster games in there. And this is where they stepped over the line. And the community let them know that they stepped over the line. There was 3 games that were included, and all reviewers have it. So this is Celeste, Shovel Knight, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Shredder's Revenge. Those 3 games are going to be removed from all SD cards that are being shipped out there. This is a thing that is a problem because those games are for sale today, and buying those games will go directly to the developer. So including those is not a great move, and I'm glad the community spoke up, and I'm glad Anbernic did backpedal and they agreed and, made sure that that wasn't the case. Obviously, we can show that these games are working, and for me, I own a tremendous amount of PC games, and you can actually double check me. You can go to my Steam profile and take a look at Fox. I own Shredder's Revenge, I own Celeste, and I owned Shovel Knight Treasure Trove. So I own all of those games already, so there's nothing really stepping over the bounds for me to be showing these, because I could take those games that I bought and owned and get them working through PortMaster, through guides and other stuff that are available through PortMaster sites, and get them running on the device. There's actually quite a number of games that you can get running. So you really should be going through that avenue, is buying the game and then doing the port yourself. I know it is a bit more work to be doing, but it is the better way to be going about this, especially if you want to be playing on these types of devices. The last thing I want to talk about, and it's one concern I have for this device, and it's a bit weird, and I don't know how I feel about it. So putting this device into standby works a bit weird. So when you press the power button, it goes off. Now what's happening here is it actually makes a save state and fully powers off the device. Now there are some benefits to this, because let's say in a traditional device like the RG35XX which does feature actual standby, when you close the lid, it's actually in a standby. When you flip it back open, the game starts up right away. With the RG40XX, the game actually gets saved and exits, and the system powers off. what you can do is then like literally pull out the power. So if you lost all the power from your battery on a device where you were on standby, that game would have been gone. It would have been off, and then you would have lost all your progress of whatever happened. In this particular instance, when we put the battery back in to kind of indicate like you're recharging the device, what happens when you power on the device, it'll boot back up and take 10 to 15 seconds to boot back up and automatically launch back into the game and load that save file for you. So it's almost like an interesting Hibernate. It's not actually hibernating. Hibernating would be taking everything that's in RAM and then putting it to disk. This is just making a save state and exiting out of the game. So that is a kind of wild way to go about doing standby. Yes, it offers very good standby life because the machine is off, but it's not quite standby. It's a weird hybrid mix. The other thing is that it doesn't work across the board for everything. While it did work for a lot of different emulators and Pico 8, and a bunch of things did work because it's leveraging RetroArch, when I ran Dreamcast, it didn't work at all. It actually just started the game back up with not actually trying to load a save file. So that's not very helpful for a Dreamcast. So standby for Dreamcast seems like it's broken. So this isn't the best case for standby. I wish they offered two ways to do this. Like if you just tap it, it went to an actual standby. And if you like double tapped or did something else, it did this weird hibernate mix. How they're doing it right now, yes, it is a very long life standby because the machine's off. So you're not using any battery at all. So technically, that is a great way to do it. It's just, I don't know. I just wish that there was other options available and not just this one. I'm kind of iffy on it. In any event, the device is $65 as a short-term sale when it first launches, which will be tomorrow by the time this video goes live. So if you wanted it to be a little bit cheaper, and that's before shipping, with shipping it's going to be like $10 extra, so it might be around $75. It'll go up to $70 afterwards, so then you're going to be in the $80 area. That's really not a bunch of money for what you're getting here, but if you own any other XDX device from Anbernic, that being an H700 device, they have been updating the firmware. I think it's version 1.5 went to 64-bit system. I don't know if it's really worthwhile to get this if you already have a previous device. If you like the design of it, it is a very small design, and they crammed a lot of stuff in there. I was initially concerned that the D-pad was a little bit too close to the analog stick. It's not. I didn't really find myself hitting in the analog stick. Even when I was playing fighting games and stuff, I never really had that happen in practice or in use, although it was a concern for a moment in time. So it's hard for me to give a full recommendation just because the H700 chipset has been in a lot of handhelds already, and it's not really going to be doing much more than those other previous handhelds already did. The latest firmware that is on here is pretty full-featured, and they have a new one coming out that offers a bit more. So I love that Anbernic is still doing that. So that's pretty much it. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. Your support really means the world to me, guys. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.